Do you want to give your photos a softer, more painterly look in just a few minutes? These 4 edits each take less than 5 minutes, but they each completely change the feel of the images. Today I'll show you 4 edits that each take less than 5 minutes. They're all slightly different, and along the way I'll share little editing tips that you can use on your own images, even if you never use textures. My first image is of a dwarf iris. Immediately you can see that my white balance was way off, but that's a quick fix. Open it in Camera Raw, click Auto, and like magic, it's looking 10 times better. Before adding a texture, I like simplifying busy backgrounds. I roughly select a highly feathered background and apply a little Gaussian blur to blend away any distracting pops of colour. This also helps the texture to blend much more naturally. Next, I go to File, Embed Texture, and navigate to your Textures folder and choose one that you like. I'm choosing my Lilac Breeze texture. Then fit it to your image. Textures aren't always the same size as your image. Next, I look through the blend modes. Rather than using the same blend mode every time, I always scroll through them first. Different images respond very differently, and sometimes the nicest result is one that I'd never have expected. And altering the opacity helps too. Because I don't want the texture over my flower, I create a mask. For this image, I want to start with roughly selecting a feathered area around the edges, and then mask that with black. This helps to give a more blended look rather than the harsh edges of just masking the flower. Then I use the Select tool to select the flower and mask the flower out unfeathered. I find this 2-stage masking gives a much more natural transition, so the texture gradually fades towards the flower instead of stopping abruptly. Then I create a duplicate layer, including the mask, and I try out the various blend modes again. This time I choose colour, as it subtly helps tone everything together much better. So here is your before and after. What I really like here is that the texture hasn't taken over. It simply softens the background and helps draw your eye to the iris. My next image is a beautiful dreamy shot of a Japanese anemone from our garden. It's already lovely as it is, so I only want a very subtle edit with this one. I embed my distressed citrine texture. I always start with around a 40% opacity, and then I adjust it from there. It's much easier to add than take away. And then I just slowly scroll through the blend modes. I do like a few in the lightened section, but eventually I settle on overlay. I create a mask, then I very roughly select a highly feathered area around the flower, feathering by 150 pixels. It's a full-size 6,000 pixel file, and I fill this with black. The transition looks a little harsh in some areas, so I fade this adjustment to 34%. Select Subject would struggle with this image because the petals melt into the background. so a soft brush actually gives a much nicer result. So I set my opacity to around about 30% and mask more over the flower, particularly in the centre, fully masking that centre whilst retaining some of the texture over the petals to help it all blend in a dreamy way. Then I duplicate this layer and I choose a lighten blend mode, but at a very low opacity in the 20s, just to help it to blend. Here is the before and the after. This one is much subtler. The texture is barely noticeable on its own, but it gives the whole photograph a softer, dreamier atmosphere. I thought I would treat you to an image of one of my pet red-eye tree frogs sat inside a flower. Here's something a little different. The texture was actually printed onto matte photo paper and photographed behind the frog, so most of the effect is already in camera. And now I'm simply enhancing it digitally. I copy and paste my shell pink texture into this. Don't worry too much about the colour of the texture. Blend modes, hue adjustments, or even converting it to black and white can completely change the final result. I didn't need to, as I chose the divide blend mode. For this image, I wanted the mask more precise, so I used the Select Subject tool to select the frog and the flower, and I filled this with black. I played around with opacity until I was happy, but I wanted a more blended, textured look, so I hopped over to my distressed citrine texture, which was already open in Photoshop, and I copied and pasted this into my image. I duplicated the mask from the previous layer and dragging it into a new texture layer. And then I reduced the opacity to around about 40%, then browsed through the blending modes, settling on soft light at around about 34%. But I wasn't finished with the two textures. I added a further layer of distressed citrine, this time very roughly selecting an area over the frog and a little of the flower, making it highly feathered and filling this with black, reducing the opacity into the 30s. This helped make my frog pop a bit more, allowing some texture over the flower to blend it all together. It's a quick, rough and ready edit. I would normally take an extra minute or two doing this. And here is the end result. It's definitely more punchy. Because the texture was already printed behind the frog, the digital texture simply ties everything together. I thought this crocus image was finished, but looking back at it a few years later, I realised there's still a few little improvements I could make. First, it needed a couple of distractions removing. So selecting these and filling with content-aware fill, and using a little Gaussian blur over these areas to help them blend in more seamlessly. Now, my attention is all on the main flower. Tiny distractions pull the eye far more than we realise. Removing them and gently softening the background keeps all the attention exactly where you want it. Next, I embed my marshmallow texture, rotating and stretching it to fit. I choose an overlay blend mode, reduce the opacity to in the low 40s. Then I selected a highly feathered area around the main flower, and I mask this out by filling with black. Then I use a black brush to refine the mask a little over the flower. I add a duplicate layer, then choose luminosity blend mode. This one shows more texture and less of the colour from the textured layer, so I bring the opacity right down. This final edit isn't about making the image dramatic. It's about making it feel more like a painting, which I think it does. Textures are just one part of the way that I create these softer, painterly images. If you'd like to experiment with the same textures that I've used here, you'll find them linked below. If you enjoyed this style of editing, I'd love to know which image was your favourite. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.